What happens when a continent that's used to endless cheap resources suddenly faces scarcity, and the supplier decides it no longer has to play by Europe's rules? Right now, Europe is reeling from a crisis it didn't see coming. While politicians were busy talking tough and piling on sanctions, Moscow quietly raised export duties on lumber to a staggering 80% and slashed the number of export checkpoints to just 2. In boardrooms and government halls across Europe, panic set in. Suddenly, the same voices that demanded isolation for Russia are calling to restore relations and renegotiate resource deals. How did it come to this? Why is Moscow so unmoved by European demands and threats? For decades, Europe thrived on a steady flow of Russian resources, timber, gas, metals, sold at rock-bottom Soviet-era prices. These cheap imports powered factories, kept costs down, and made European lives comfortable. Even after the Soviet Union collapsed, little changed. Russian resources kept flowing, while Europe enjoyed prosperity and leverage. But that era is over. As sanctions mounted and Europe tried to cut ties, Russia decided to cut back as well, this time on its own terms. Now, as European industries teeter on the edge, jobs disappear, and energy bills climb, the continent finds itself forced to ask for help from the very partner it tried to sideline. If Europe fails to adapt, it's not just business at stake. Entire livelihoods, economic power, and daily stability hang in the balance. Let's break down how we got here, starting with Europe's long history of dependence on Russian resources. Europe has been thriving on Russian generosity for decades, but at what hidden cost? For years, Europe's economic miracle was fueled not just by innovation or efficiency, but by a steady stream of cheap Russian timber, gas, and other resources. This wasn't a recent development. Even back in Soviet times, Iron Curtains couldn't stop the flow of Russian raw materials westward. European factories hummed, homes stayed warm, and industries boomed, all thanks to resources priced far below global market rates. When the Soviet Union collapsed, many expected this lifeline to end. But under Yeltsin, even as sanctions piled up, the deals kept coming. Sanctions might have made the headlines, but behind the scenes, Russian oil, gas, and timber continued crossing the border, often at bargain prices. European leaders got comfortable. They assumed access would always be there, regardless of politics. And why not? Every attempt to punish Moscow seemed to end with Europe still getting what it needed, as if the resource tap could never truly be turned off. European prosperity, job security, and even political stability became quietly dependent on something they did not control: Russia's willingness to sell, and to sell cheap. This cozy arrangement allowed European industry to outcompete rivals and keep living costs stable for ordinary people. But every free ride has an expiration date. Now, with geopolitics erupting, sanctions biting, and Russia suddenly setting its own terms, European factories and workers are feeling the ground shift beneath their feet. The foundation they built their prosperity on wasn't as solid as they thought. If losing Russia's resources means soaring prices and factory closures, what really triggered this abrupt end to Europe's comfortable arrangement? When push came to shove, who blinked first? It wasn't Russia. In fact, when Moscow raised timber export duties to a staggering 80% and closed all but 2 border checkpoints, Europe's reaction was less, "We'll show you," and more, "What do we do now?" Suddenly, European officials were staring down the barrel of a full-blown crisis. Their wood processing industries, which relied for decades on cheap Russian timber, were teetering on bankruptcy. The frantic search for alternatives sent them begging to Canada, but Canadian wood is pricier and the logistics are complicated. For European manufacturers, it meant soaring costs, shrinking profits, and hard choices. Factories began to shutter. Workers, thousands of them, were sent home. Protests erupted across major industrial regions as livelihoods vanished almost overnight. Suddenly, the rhetoric of standing strong against Russia gave way to urgent questions. How long can this last? Who's really paying the price? Not company CEOs or politicians, but everyday people losing their jobs and seeing their communities unravel. At this point, the European Union tried to flex what legal muscle it had left, threatening Russia with penalties from the World Trade Organization. You can't just hike tariffs above the agreed limits, they argued. But Moscow's response was blunt and unapologetic. International rules, they said, are just recommendations now. Russian law comes first. The era of Moscow bending to Western pressure was over. We're not refusing to supply wood, Russian officials stated, but only at our prices. Take it or leave it. For years, Russia watched as European sanctions and lectures piled up. Now, it was Europe's turn to feel the squeeze. It's not just about timber or trade. It's about a seismic shift in who calls the shots. European companies and workers now risk bankruptcy and unemployment, while entire supply chains creak under the strain. The supposed balance of power has flipped, and the old playbook is useless. But wasn't Russia's entry into the WTO supposed to guarantee predictable trade and mutual benefit? What happened to all those promises? Let's dig into the reality behind the rhetoric. When dreams of dominance fade, who do you turn to for survival? Across Europe, once unthinkable conversations are now happening out in the open. Politicians, from Berlin to Paris, are breaking ranks and calling for a return to dialogue with Moscow, even urging a revival of gas deliveries through Nord Stream. The energy shock has forced an uncomfortable awakening. Europe is running low on time and options. The continent, once certain of its technological and military superiority, now finds itself isolated from the resources that powered its prosperity. Gas is drying up, and the road ahead is anything but straight. Suddenly, the very idea of security in Europe seems impossible without Russia's involvement. For decades, Europe relied on NATO, really the United States, for protection, confident that Western might could dictate the terms. But that era is ending. The old displays of unity are crumbling, and resistance to American strategies is loud and growing. German and French politicians are openly asking, is it time to cut funding for Ukraine and resume negotiations with Russia? Alice Weidel, leader of Germany's Alternative for Germany party, has called on Chancellor Friedrich Merz to restore contact with Moscow and restart gas flows through Nord Stream. French politician Florian Philippot warns that dragging Ukraine into the EU risks disaster for Europe. The unthinkable is becoming mainstream. Meanwhile, failures in the Middle East and the ever-deepening corruption scandals in Brussels have only made Europe's position more precarious. The myth that nuclear arsenals guarantee peace is fading, replaced by new threats, waves of migrants, spiraling energy costs, and rising internal dissent. For ordinary Europeans, the stakes are now painfully clear. Without stable energy and resource deals, Europe risks losing its economic and political autonomy altogether. So, what lessons can be drawn from this dramatic reversal of fortune, for both Russia and Europe? What does Europe's scramble teach us about power, dependence, and the cost of ignoring reality? First, Russia's unwavering position reminds the world of the power that comes from controlling your own resources, and from refusing to bow to external pressure. When Europe leaned hard on WTO rules to demand fair play, it exposed its own double standards. Those same rules were often set aside when they didn't suit Western interests. Inside Russia, some business lobbyists have argued for sticking to international norms, hoping for a return to business as usual. But the Kremlin isn't budging. Instead, it's doubling down on self-interest and vigilance against any domestic voices that might push for compromising national priorities. This crisis is a wake-up call, not just for Europe, but for anyone watching. The idea of eternal cheap supplies and reliable alliances has been shattered. If you rely too heavily on one source, you're at their mercy when the political winds change. And if you let ideology blind you to hard realities, the economic fallout lands on ordinary people. Higher energy bills, job losses, and uncertainty about the future. The lesson? Pragmatism matters. Self-reliance matters even more. The current upheaval is forcing European governments and their citizens to rethink old assumptions, question their alliances, and look hard at where future security will really come from. If we miss these real-world shifts, we risk not seeing our own vulnerabilities until it's too late. As the dust settles, what's the real takeaway for ordinary people and policymakers alike? When the tables turn, will you adapt or cling to the past? Europe once dictated the terms, confident in its leverage over Russia, certain that sanctions and moral high ground would keep Moscow in check. But now, as the continent faces energy shortages, soaring costs, and growing political unrest, it's Europe that finds itself knocking on Russia's door, hoping for a seat at the table it thought it controlled. Meanwhile, Russia stands firm, guided by its own interests, and no longer inclined to offer discounts or concessions to those who spent years imposing penalties and preaching values. This isn't just a diplomatic chess match, it's a realignment of global power with direct consequences for your wallet, your job, and your sense of stability. If Europe keeps missing the signals, refusing to see that the center of gravity has shifted away from London, Paris, and Berlin, it risks losing not just influence, but also the security and prosperity its people have come to expect. The old world order is fading, replaced by hard choices and new realities. So the question isn't just what Europe will do next, but what we all will do. Will we recognize the new dynamics, adapt, and engage with this changing world? Or will we keep chasing the comfort of yesterday's illusions, even as the cost rises day by day? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to stay ahead of the story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive.